And thus it was in Harlem in those days. A few years later, I had another experience which will sound strange, but what I'm trying to convey to you is it happened so suddenly. The police officers are thrust into these situations. There's not a lot of time to think about it. There's no time to page through law books and look for a precedent. There's rarely time to plan a strategy. It's you and your own self-defense. A few years later, as a result of that arrest, I was promoted to drive in a police car, to ride in a police car, because foot patrol was as low as you can get on the police totem pole. As George, the president of the POA, will tell you, it's pretty boring most of the time, even in a high crime area like Harlem. But in a police car, we just never stop. And one day we had a call of a shooting. And it was in my partner and I's district on Lenox Avenue at about 115th Street. And we proceeded down Lenox Avenue, which is a major thoroughfare. It goes into Central Park and leads right into Midtown Manhattan. So it's almost like a highway. And despite all of the things the New York Times said about us, we were not an oppressive group of people, and there was a lot of double parking there that should not have been allowed, but we tried to get people to move their cars and not write those tickets like the story I told you about. In fact, I once inadvertently gave Malcolm X a ticket on the very corner. I said inadvertently because I didn't know who he was, and there were about 200 people looking at me from Mosque number 7. And he raised his hand, it was all over, and I looked back at the police car to make sure my partner wasn't reading the newspaper, but had the radio in his hand. And I must say, I faced a dilemma that police officers faced, whether you put your pen back in your pocket and get ready for combat, or you keep writing. Once you started the ticket, you had to complete it. And Malcolm X looked at me and he said, "Officer, why am I getting this ticket?" I said, "Is that your car, sir?" He said, "Yes, it is." And I had taken out my ticket book, and a lot of people, it was like waving a magic wand. They came out from everywhere and they moved their cars, but he had it, but I didn't know it was his car. And he didn't say anything further, just turned around and went back in, and all those people that would have surrounded us and who knows what, didn't do anything. However, one day when we had the shooting call, there was so much double parking that we couldn't pull up in front of the tenement that the shooting had been reported in. And I know this sounds funny, and that's why I'm taking so much time to explain it. But the sergeant's car was there, and another car was there, which meant 4 police officers were already at the scene of the shooting. And so I let my partner out. That meant 5 police officers were there. And then I had to drive another block to find an illegal parking space at a fire hydrant. I walked back to the report of this shooting, and you're never totally relaxed when you're wearing that blue uniform, because unfortunately it's a hated target for all too many people in our society. But there were 5 police on the scene, and I didn't even know if it really had been a shooting. And as I started up the stairs, I heard something from under the stairwell. There was a hollow space under the stairwell where they stored the ash cans from the furnace. And being a policeman, I looked under the stairs because there were many drug deals or other crimes being committed in these buildings. And I saw a young man poking around in the trash can. Well, and policemen are trained to be suspicious, so I crept back down the stairs, and as I approached him, he sensed my presence and he turned around, and I was looking into the barrel of a .38 caliber revolver, standing about 6 feet away from him. It was too far to jump forward and take the gun away from him, and I had absolutely no opportunity to draw my own weapon, and your body just braces itself as if it somehow could protect you against that lethal piece of lead that would come into your chest and ricochet through your vital organs. And for a moment I could see in his eyes, I can kill a cop today. And then your training kicked in, and I hear this very authoritative voice say, "Give me that damn thing." And my hand went out, and he thought about it for a second, and then he handed over the revolver. So I turned him around to handcuff him, but also so he couldn't see how much my hands were shaking. And then, with a flourish that I must confess to, I led him up the stairs into the apartment, dangling the gun and pointing to my prisoner in front of the sergeant. And the other cops were there, and they all turned in amazement. Turned out that his sister had been shot so close to the heart that they could never retrieve the bullet. So we had a possible homicide. And there were 5 policemen begging her to tell them what happened. She wouldn't. In fact, I thought her last moments on earth might well be filled with profanities of the names she was calling the white policemen who were present, instead of telling us who had shot her. But the boy that I arrested was 17, and his best friend was there, and we took him in the car, and he claimed not to know anything about it. And this was prior to the Supreme Court saying cops weren't allowed to talk to suspected criminals. So I talked to him, and took a very wayward route to the police station, and he kept denying that he didn't know anything about it. And I said, you know, you ever hear of a paraffin test? They put powder on your hand and it can tell if you've recently fired a gun. Now, in the history of 150 years in the New York City Police Department, they had never given anyone a paraffin test. But I didn't see any need to mention that to him. And I said, if you're lying, gee, it wouldn't look so good. No, this is the time to tell the truth. And he said, okay, it's my gun, but it went off accidentally. And so he was booked for attempted murder and possession of a loaded firearm, and took him through the process. And the next day in court, he showed up. He was released, by the way, in his own recognizance by the judge. But he and his friend, the boy that I had arrested, showed up with their ties and their parents and their clergymen, and they went through a hearing. And of course, the victim, who did live but carried a bullet with her for the rest of her life, was not there. And the judge let him go. And that was the end of that case. I called the DA afterwards and said, why is there no prosecution? And he said, well, you didn't bring me a complaining witness, like it was my fault. Well, anyway, about a year later, I had a robbery arrest, and I was downtown in headquarters, and where the prisoners got their mugshot taken, and my prisoner was waiting, and I was waiting outside this huge cage filled with prisoners, and I hear someone yelling, "Hey Mac, hey Mac!" And I thought it was one of my colleagues, a policeman. And I turned around, and there it is, the fellow that I had confessed after being told about the non-existent paraffin test. And so I went over